Hi, and welcome to The Details, where we take a deeper look at the recipes and methodologies put forth in the Basics series. Today we'll be going over the grilled brisket video, which you can find via the card on screen now. My aim today is to give further understanding of the hot but slow method I utilized in the video and how it differs from the more common low and slow cooking technique many people may be familiar with, explain in slightly more detail the concept of fire management I utilized, have a brief discussion about dry rub and share the basics of the recipe I used, and talk about the basting and glazing process and the concept of layering flavor. First, let's start by going over the hardware I used in just a little bit more detail. First, let's discuss the charcoal. I utilize a decent quality lump charcoal that I purchased at BJ's Wholesale. Now, the topic of charcoal quality is one that many people will spend a lot of time debating, and while others may emphasize the nuances of certain brands or types, I define a good quality charcoal by one main metric: size diversity. I prefer a hardwood lump charcoal that contains both very large and quite small pieces. I find the diversity in size makes fire management easier. Large pieces take longer to be fully consumed, providing a battery in which to convey thermal energy from one round of charcoal to the next. Smaller pieces are consumed quite quickly and help provide faster and hotter on-demand temperature that helps recover what was lost while the lid was open. Next up are the tumbleweeds, which are easily the best fire starting product I've found so far. I used to keep a large collection of scrap paper and paper bags specifically for lighting my grill. My main gripe with paper over tumbleweeds is that the paper produces a lot of ash, which must then be cleaned off the grates before cooking can begin. Tumbleweeds, by contrast, can produce a very small amount of ash, meaning the prep after the prep takes much less time. Finally is the chimney starter. There isn't much to be said about this, as it's a fairly straightforward piece of equipment. I recommend using one that is large, heavy, and basic. I've used lighter, cheaper, and more complex ones in the past, and they all eventually degrade, most fairly quickly. This large, simple one has lasted by and far much longer than any of the others. In the basics, I briefly mentioned that I wanted to understart the charcoal in the chimney, not letting it go to full burn before dumping it out. There are two reasons behind this. Firstly, I don't want to produce too much heat right away. While my cooking method here produces more heat than you probably expect, I still want to keep that heat under control. Secondly, this recipe is a long one, taking almost 10 hours from start to finish. Coal longevity is important as it makes the process more manageable. By under-firing the first batch, I kept the initial temperature under wraps and also provided that first round with a decent amount of black, unconsumed charcoal that would slowly begin to ignite and burn down over the course of the next hour, meaning I wouldn't need to add any additional fuel. Upon returning from the initial load of charcoal, I'm sure many people were and would be surprised to see I was cooking at almost 500 degrees. This is double or more than the normally accepted temperature to cook a piece of meat like brisket, so what gives? My main line of thinking when cooking brisket and other similar cuts of beef and pork is that the flavor of the meat should be taking center stage. The truly low and slow cooking methods I see many others utilize tends to emphasize smoke, rub, marinades, brines, and sauces more. The brisket in those recipes is a vehicle for other flavors. My recipe and methodology puts more emphasis on the meat, specifically the Maillard reactions that occur on the surface of the brisket when exposed to high temperatures. Maillard reactions, or the browning of meat at high temperature, doesn't even start until you've hit 280 degrees, about 30 degrees higher than what most people would low and slow cook the brisket at. And caramelization occurs at even higher temperatures, well over 300 degrees. Both of these types of reactions happen at the level of the meat and are not something you can really obtain as an after effect. By running the heat high for the first 5 hours or so, I'm creating a cooking environment specifically tailored to those reactions. By exceeding the 300 degree mark by quite a bit, I also open the door for the flavorful effect of charring. By charring parts of the meat, in this case the corners, edges, and the bottom, you introduce another entirely new layer of flavor, again based solely around the meat itself. After the initial hot rounds that help develop a good crust of brown caramelized meat, I then back the heat down so the process stops. Continuing to dump heat into something that is already caramelized will advance the process into full pyrolysis. While a small amount of pyrolysis is acceptable in the form of charring, allowing it to continue will lead to a burnt final product. Now, I could be considered a bit of a hypocrite as I do utilize both a dry rub and a basting liquid in this recipe. That said, both were designed with the meat in mind. In neither case did I utilize strong flavors that would overpower the meat. In fact, I chose ingredients who chemically assisted in the browning process I just mentioned. The dry rub I utilize is a ratio-based recipe that consists of 1 part kosher salt, 2 parts brown sugar, and 1 part flavor, where flavor is any other dry spices. In my case, the last part was comprised of granulated onion, paprika, curry powder, celery salt, and garlic salt, in order of most to least. While the last 2 items do have a salt content, it's only a small amount. With only a quarter of the dry rub having all the flavor, the rub is mostly for the effects of the salt and the sugar. Both help osmose protein-laden liquid out of the meat, helping with the browning processes, and the sugar provides a foundation for caramelization. The basting liquid I used was also designed with browning in mind, being comprised roughly of 2 parts sweet, 2 parts acidic, and 1 part other. The sweet again provides additional sugars to aid in the caramelization process, something you can see in the video as the meat gets much darker after I basted it. And the acid helps denature proteins, assisting in the Maillard reactions. The other was just there to facilitate a small amount of flavor, playing a small overall role in the taste of the brisket itself. This brings me to the final topic, which is the layering of flavors. This is something that I will most likely talk a lot about in the future, and is a cornerstone to my approach of cooking. The idea, as it exists in my mind, is to highlight a core flavor, in this case the meat itself, and identify flavors and methods that build upon it, but do not cover it up. The idea is to only subtly add additional flavors, never using anything too strong or too heavy-handedly. In the case of the brisket, I took 2 steps to avoid covering up the flavor of the meat. Firstly was a short curing time for the dry rub. I rubbed the meat only 24 hours in advance and utilized a rub that had flavor but was overall quite simple. Secondly, the basting liquid I used was actually thinned down with water. This physically prevented the flavors from covering up that of the brisket by causing much of the base to simply run off, and that which did stay on was a very thin layer. I also stopped at 2 applications, discarding the rest of the basting liquid, as any more would have proven to bring more flavor than the brisket itself could stand up to. That is all for this episode of The Details. Look for other episodes in the weeks following any new installment of The Basics. Thank you for watching, and make sure to subscribe and share.